Hi, everyone. Welcome to the fifth program of the Itasca Water's Practical Water Wisdom Series. Thanks for taking time today to attend this session. We really appreciate that you care about water quality. I'm Stephanie Kessler, your host for today's program. Itasca Waters is a local nonprofit that has been active in Itasca County since 2009. If you haven't done so, you can check out our many accomplishments on our website, itascawaters.org, where you can also access a variety of clean water practices. But in brief, our goal has been to find grants to do research on local water quality and to do educational events such as this to share that knowledge. We have an outstanding lineup of speakers for our series through 2022 and hope that you will gain new ideas and strategies for keeping your water healthy. We thank our partners for making these events possible: the Grand Rapids Area Community Foundation Fund, Minnesota Sea Grant, Itasca Soil and Water Conservation District, Itasca Coalition of Lake Associations, Rapids Radio, KAXE, KBXE Radio, and the Blandin Foundation. Hosting the question and answer section today will be Itasca Waters board member and manager of the Itasca County AIS program, Bill Granchis. The format for this session will be a presentation from our speaker, followed by an opportunity to ask questions. To ask questions, simply click on Q&A at the bottom of your screen and type a brief question into the dialog box. You can do that at any time during our speaker's presentation, and Bill will read those questions to our speaker during the Q&A section. Similar questions may be combined, and we may not get to all the questions if we run out of time. This program is being recorded and will be available for viewing online through our website, itascawaters.org. Finally, we value your opinion and hope you will complete the evaluation form that will be in a link at the end of this presentation and sent to you by email after today's session. Our topic today is understanding Minnesota's changing climate, and our speaker today has an outstanding resume. Dr. Kenny Blumenfeld is a climate scientist who grew up in Minnesota with a love of storms, blizzards, and being outside. He works for the Minnesota State Climatology Office with the Department of Natural Resources, where he provides the state's agencies, communities, and citizens with up-to-date scientific information about Minnesota's changing and variable climate. Dr. Blumenfeld enjoys talking to Minnesotans about their weather and often does it long after the workday is done. Minnesota's climate is famous for its ups, downs, and extremes, but our climate is also experiencing changes unlike anything we have observed previously. Today's presentation will break down trends in Minnesota's climate to its essential points, particularly emphasizing the ongoing changes in the quantity, timing, and intensity of precipitation, the rapid rate of winter warming, and how these changes have affected water features in Minnesota. We will also peer into the future to see what lies ahead according to the best available science. For the next hour, Dr. Blumenfeld is all ours, and we welcome him to Itasca Water's Practical Water Wisdom Series. Dr. Blumenfeld, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. I appreciate the kind introduction, and I'm really happy to be here. And I'm going to share my screen and we can begin. Great. Okay, thanks everybody. So my name's Kenny. I work with the DNR State Climatology Office. So we're located in St. Paul. We're part of the Department of Natural Resources, but we're inside, we're kind of housed on the St. Paul campus of the University of Minnesota. And we definitely serve much more than just the Department of Natural Resources. We're what you might think of as a public-facing office. So we get calls from people all the time. We do a lot of media interviews, and we're essentially set up to be Minnesota's official climate authority, kind of the way that the National Weather Service is the official weather authority. They're the forecasting authority, and we are the climate archiving and sharing authority for the state of Minnesota. My job in particular is to help people understand what's going on with our climate. That's a big part of what I do. It's not entirely what I do, but it's a big part of it. I'm also just, someone who's always liked the state, its resources, its weather, as Stephanie mentioned in the introduction. And so this is, I feel really lucky to do this. And I should say, I was up in Itasca County last week. I was actually in Grand Rapids and in the area around it too. So I like northern Minnesota. I know northern Minnesota pretty well. And so I'm happy to talk about, get more specific as needed here. Okay, so we'll kind of begin. So before we talk about what's happening with our climate, I always tell people, well, there's some things we want to keep in mind. One is that we're not the same as other parts of the country or other parts of the world. For example, think of, and I mean this from a climate standpoint. So think of how you might describe Minnesota's winter to somebody who hasn't been here. I mean, you'd probably say, well, it's a long, cold, and sometimes snowy winter. And then you might also say, well, in the summers are short, but they can be pretty intense. They can be hot and humid, and they're often pretty stormy. In fact, summers are wet season. So that's when we get a lot of our precipitation. But you also know that not every winter is the same in terms of severity, right? There's variations from one winter to the next. And there are also variations in our summer, and no 2 years are identical, really, and we know this. There's actually pretty big swings, even in what we consider to be normal climate here in Minnesota. Now, that's just the first point I like to make. Now, think of if we were doing the same thing. I mean, not that I expect you to know exactly how you would summarize, say, California's climate, but you have to know that they'd have a very different description of their winter at a minimum. And their summers, even though there's differences from northern to southern parts of California, their summers are not like ours. They tend to be dry, and they're not as humid. So you can kind of intuit that there's differences in just the baseline climate. The same thing if we were doing this for Florida. Florida doesn't even have winters, and their summers are much more humid, much longer than ours. They don't really have the same kind of severe weather season that we have. And now you could do this different parts of the world. So you have to remember that our climate is already different from other areas in the world, other areas in the country even. And therefore, as global temperatures have risen, and as those rising global temperatures have started to trigger changes in the weather patterns, which we end up calling climate change, the symptoms of those changes that we experience here are also going to be different from other parts of the US and the world. Now, we do share some commonalities with these other places, but there's some changes that these other areas have that we don't have, and vice versa. There's some changes that are kind of all ours. So we'll get into the specifics of what those are, but you have to remember this: for every place in the world, there are going to be geographically important differences that change whatever that sort of climate story is. Second point is climate isn't just the future, which is often what people think. I mean, in fact, 40 years ago, there really was no field of climate projections, climate future, because we didn't have the technology for it and we didn't have the scientific foundation for it. We do now. Very sophisticated models that are run telling us what the future is going to be like. But climatology and climate science really have two different branches. You have the observations, which use instrumentation and things that have measurements of things that have happened. And that takes us, as soon as the instrumental record began, in general, 100 to 150 years ago, depending on where you are, and they tell you what's happened right up until now. So we know a lot about where our climate has been and where it is going currently, where it is right now based on observations. But if you really want to get into the future, you can't rely solely on observations. You can't look at your rain gauge and really understand what's going to happen in 32 years. You need a comprehensive set of projections that help you, that kind of integrate all the complexities of the atmosphere and rotating Earth, and the fact that it's all, fluid mechanics interacting with all these complexities. And you need a way of incorporating the fact that we're changing some of the foundational composition of the atmosphere in a way that affects the distribution of heat and energy. And then you need to kind of be able to push play and get a series of simulations that help you understand what the future is going to be like. These are two different branches, the observations and the projections. And this also really matters because most people don't get their climate information from science, right? They get it from communicators that might be on the news. It might be non-scientists on the news, or might even be from friends or something that's shared on social media. That's where most people get their climate information. They're not reading the science journals or digging into the data. And a lot of times when you're getting climate information from one of these less formal sources, they might not remember to tell you, oh yeah, we're talking about a change that's already been observed, or we're talking about a change that hasn't yet been observed but is projected to occur. A lot of the people that we work with here in our office that use our information have to make decisions. They're in some kind of planning capacity, they manage a resource, and they need to make decisions. And it really does matter. Are we talking about a change that's already occurred, in which case we need to change the management of the resource now, versus, are we talking about something where the change hasn't occurred yet, but it's projected with high confidence to occur in the decades ahead? Just imagine the way you would kind of structure your planning efforts with that kind of information. So it's important to keep that in mind. I try and make that clear in this presentation. And then the last thing is basically what people argue about, and it's usually the wrong argument, sort of the weather versus climate, because they both can be true, all right? So we have ups and downs that are totally normal to our climate, right? We have a relatively warm winter and the next winter is horribly harsh, or we have a long and dry summer followed by one that's kind of cool and wet. I mean, we know our climate here in Minnesota especially is prone to swings. So whatever you think of as average, we know that the joke is that average never really happens here, right? It's that average is based on just sort of the balance between the sort of normal extremes that we experience here in Minnesota. We call that variability, ups and downs, right? At the same time, we have what you may have heard referred to as trends. Trends is kind of a misused word. It has statistical meaning. It means that there's this kind of statistically significant ongoing change in the behavior of some kind of variable. It can be measured. Most people don't think of that when they think of the word trend. And because in the last decade, the word trend has kind of seeped into social media and Google search optimization, it's gotten clouded a little bit. But think of it as a dominant or predominant tendency. So like if you're a dominant or predominant tendency would be, something like not every single year is warm or warmer than it used to be, but we're starting to see with increasing frequency that the average temperature for a given year is above the historical averages. And so that would be what we mean by a trend, and maybe the values are continuing to kind of average upwards, even if we're not observing that phenomenon every single year. These two notions, that we can have a tendency or a trend in place and also normal variations, are not at all at odds with each other. But this is often what people are arguing about, because someone will say, well, how can you say that we're getting warmer when we just had this horrible cold outbreak? Well, there's nothing about the trend towards warmer conditions that suggests we would never have cold. There's just nothing at all. Nobody's suggesting, for example, that Minnesota is going to stop having variations and normal ups and downs. We're still going to have those. They'll always be in place. Similarly, some people maybe want to grab onto one really hot day during the summer and point to that as kind of proof of the trend. And you sort of have to ask yourself, well, is it within the range of what had been normal? You know, is that the kind of day we had had before? And can we really say that one day is proof of a trend? So these things are often used for kind of, I would say they're misused by people who are maybe arguing about the wrong thing. We have a highly variable climate. That's a fact. We also have changes, and that's also a fact. Whether people are comfortable with that or not is a whole other matter. So here's an example, just taking the average temperature from around Minnesota back to the beginning of our sort of unified climate record. We've got some stations with longer histories than this, but this is, we can take Minnesota's temperatures back to 1895 with reasonable confidence, and this is true around the country. So this is kind of an average, it's an annual average. Each point is a year, and each year's value represents whatever the average of all of the daily temperature measurements were around Minnesota for that year using a kind of geographical averaging technique. But you see the ups and downs along, right? There no two consecutive dots are very few consecutive dots are in the exact same place, and some of them are pretty far apart. And certainly over a span of even just 5 years, you could see pretty big swings. You could also see what your eyes are telling you, a very obvious story. If you just say, well, what's the tendency over time with these temperatures? Are annual average temperatures tending to kind of stay the same? I think your eyes will tell you, no, there's some kind of increase. It's certainly not happening every year, but you can kind of see that increase underway. If we use the various tools that kind of aid visualization here or are used to describe tendencies or trends, you see that straight line. That's the trend line. It's based on a simple branch of statistics. And this one suggests that Minnesota has been increasing its average temperature on average at a rate of about not quite a quarter of a degree Fahrenheit per decade. Accumulated over this period, it gets you pretty close to about 3 degrees Fahrenheit of total temperature change averaged around the state. Now you can also see that red line, the squigglier one, that's been superimposed over that. And that kind of shows you, this is a 9-year moving average. It shows you basically that the individual ups and downs that are kind of happening from year to year, they do have these kind of modes of higher or lower tendency to be, above or below that diagonal line, that trend line. And this is just a way of saying, we know that we have these kind of longer term trends showing us getting warmer. But even within that longer term trend, you have periods that are cooler than you would expect from the trend line alone, and periods that are warmer than you would expect from the trend line alone. But that on average, temperatures in Minnesota have been going up, even though that's not something that we're going to experience every single year here in the state. So here are the trends that we have observed. And again, we're talking about a dominant or predominant tendency. On an annual level, Minnesota has gotten wetter. That's most true in southern Minnesota. It's a little less true up in northern Minnesota, but on a statewide basis, it's still factual. And Minnesota has gotten warmer. That's true everywhere, and especially in northern Minnesota. When you put these two pieces together, you can actually see, and we're not going to be able to, we don't have time to investigate every single piece of this, but you actually see a fairly major shift that occurred sometime in the last 30 to 50 years, where we just kind of flipped into what appears to be a whole new climate regime where we're getting increasingly wetter years and increasingly warmer years, and a large number of years that are both wet and warm, even though that's not what we see every single year. And so this is something we've already observed. These changes are also projected to continue. In other words, it's not just an ongoing change, but the best available science suggests we're going to be in a wetter and warmer place as we go out 30, 50, 70 years from now. We'll just keep getting, we almost positive we're going to keep getting warmer. And of quite likely that we will keep getting wetter, even if there are going to be variations away from that that make us really dry for 1, 2, or 3 years, or maybe even the better part of a decade. Still, the general tendency that we see in the models is for us to get warmer as we get warmer and wetter as we get into the future. Uh, our winters, on average, have been shorter. They've been less cold. They've had as much or more snowfall than we were accustomed to historically, but they've had less snow cover than we were accustomed to historically. The biggest change that we've observed here in Minnesota is that sort of bold bullet point right under it, the rapid loss in cold weather extremes. Now, we still get very cold. Grand Rapids, Itasca County, you still get really cold. We're not saying that there won't be cold conditions, and we're not even saying that there haven't been and won't continue to be cold extremes. But it is true that the frequency of cold extremes that we used to have has really dropped off. So the number of nights that hit -30 or -35 in your neck of the woods, they're just not what they used to be. It used to be much more common. Still dangerously cold with some regularity in northern Minnesota, but what we used to think of as very cold is now either rare or non-existent, and what we now think of as very cold used to be somewhat more common. These are changes that will continue. They will. This has a very strong relationship with why global temperatures are increasing anyway, because of greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases, they don't actually intensify sunlight and make things hotter, so to speak. But what they instead do is they absorb heat that's coming off of the planet and that's leaving the land, and they absorb some of that heat before it escapes into space. And that is most active during night, and especially during the winter time when there's not a lot of sunlight coming in. And so there's a very strong relationship between the winter warming that we've observed and the fact that we've got additional greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And then there's some feedbacks that actually amplify this effect and make it more pronounced. In the summertime, what we've seen mostly, northern Minnesota is a little bit different, especially north of Highway 2. We've started to see hotter summer days, but we're not outside of the historical ranges for what we had observed. And that's an important distinction, because when we are trying to understand what's really changing in our climate, what's kind of changing in ways we haven't seen before, one of the things you have to do is you have to look backwards, and you get your historical ranges. If you can see my hands, I'm kind of showing high and low values. And if the values you're observing now are between your high and low values, then it's hard to make the case that anything really significant has changed. It's when you start getting outside of those historical ranges that you start saying, okay, well, now we're starting to see conditions that we had never really observed before. And we're not quite there yet with summer high temperatures. It's not the same, but in the winter time, we're definitely there with the low temperatures. They're just much warmer than with high frequency than what we had observed before. So anyway, in the summertime, what we're really seeing is fewer cool nights. It's not that we don't have them. We still get cool nights. We still get those rare kind of early summer or late summer frosts. It's just that kind of like what we saw in winter, the extremes of summer coolness don't occur as much anymore. And we're seeing more frequent and heavier downpours. So even in a somewhat dry year or in a normal year where you might have normal precipitation, you just might have noticed that it seems like it rains a lot harder than it used to. And that's because we've seen this uptick in the frequency and the severity or intensity of these kind of 1 or 2 or 3 inch daily rainfalls. So they're a little bit more common than they used to be. And I guess the adage, when it rains, it pours, is maybe a little more common now too, a little more appropriate now. We've seen our really big events, those kind of what we call mega rains, or the massive ones where you get flash flooding over a large area. Those are still rare events, but they have become a little bit more frequent, and they have become a little bit bigger in recent decades. And those changes are also projected to continue. when we look at what hasn't changed yet in Minnesota, and this is always helpful for me to point out to people, like I said, the extremes of heat have not really increased in frequency or severity. And in fact, in some cases, if you're just looking at air temperature, there's signs of kind of a downward trend over all but northern Minnesota. When you include the effects of humidity, it's a slightly different story, but we don't have anywhere through any means any evidence that there's a big change in underway in the really extreme heat events. Not yet. That does appear likely by mid-century. So we have not yet observed a worsening of our heat extremes in most of Minnesota yet, but all of the models are unanimous that there's just going to be so much additional heat around as global temperatures continue going up that the nasty heat extremes, whether they're the dry heat extremes like we had in the 1930s, where you get really, really high temperatures, or the humid heat extremes where it's just oppressively muggy and maybe the temperatures are only in the mid 90s, but the dew point temperatures in the upper 70s or low 80s, and it's unbearable outside. One way or the other, we're going to have more heat extremes by mid-century because there's just so much more heat around. Drought, similarly, 2021 was a terrible year for a lot of Minnesota. Itasca County was hit hard with plummeting water levels and really dry conditions. But that was the first drought we'd had really badly in a long time. And over the past several decades, drought frequency and severity has been declining because we've been so much wetter. So there has been no trend of worsening drought conditions, but same with the heat extremes. As we get into the future, especially the years that have the really hot summers with new kind of extremes of heat that we haven't yet observed, those years, if they're paired with dry conditions, we could have some tough times from a drought standpoint. But we have not yet observed that kind of worsening condition yet. And then the big, tree breaking storms, the ones that produce tornadoes or high winds or even hail. We don't really have any evidence that those have become more common or that they have become worse. We do have some evidence, though, that the season is expanding. So kind of a longer window when you might get those, and a bit of a northward shift too that accompanies that. So for example, last October, we had a tornado in the Boundary Waters that had to be, pretty sure it's the latest farthest north tornado ever recorded in the United States. It was, right up on the Canadian border, and it was in I want to say October 9th or something like that. So there's this kind of expansion of the season and the geographic range, but we don't have a worsening of these. This year has been quite stormy with a lot of severe thunderstorms in northern and western Minnesota. And we hadn't had one of those in a long time, but there's no real long-term trend yet indicating that these are going to get worse. When we look into the future, kind of like drought and heat extremes, there's some indication that the most intense of these severe weather events could become even more intense or show some sorts of increase, maybe have larger outbreaks. Those are possible as we get into the future. But I want to stress with this point, this is one area where there really is no scientific consensus. Everyone's pretty much clear that number one and number two will probably both at least intensify as we get into the future because there's just so much more heat around. But this number 3 point about the severe convective storms, there's really no broad agreement on what's happening with those. I would just say expect them. It's part of Minnesota's climate. Sometimes, we've got anyone who's really familiar with your area knows that, Lake Roosevelt, just to the southwest of most of Itasca County, got absolutely pounded in 1969 by a horrific tornado. And we can look back even farther and see tornadoes throughout Minnesota as part of our history. We've had massive windstorms and hailstorms throughout our history. And so it's one of these things that's already pretty bad at times. And I would say expect that to continue at a minimum until we get more information about those types of events. So here's how the warming has looked. This map, you kind of maybe you have to lean close. Minnesota's, of course, right there in the upper middle of the map. And this is, I'm sorry, this is precipitation. So here's how the precipitation has looked. If you can see the brown colors on the map, those would be periods where it was dry. And of course, the beginning of the 20th century was the famous Dust Bowl era. It was very dry in Minnesota. Some of our driest years on record occurred then. And so it shouldn't be surprising that when we look at all of these periods comparatively, the driest period was kind of the first part of the 20th century. And then we started normalizing or getting wetter. But look at the bottom right 3 panels there. We just got, in the last 3 decades, these are 30-year averages, you can just see Minnesota getting wetter and wetter and wetter. Now, it's not that every year is super wet. We still have these ups and downs, and we still have drought built in there. But it's that the years that were wet were at times wetter than anything we had observed before. Minnesota keeps breaking its own recent precipitation records. It did it 3 different times during the 2010s, and the 2010s incidentally finished as our wettest decade on record, and that was on a statewide basis. There were parts of Minnesota that were just obliterating their precipitation records. And this year, interestingly, even though a lot of the state has really dried out again and we're kind of turning into drought conditions in southern Minnesota, up in the far north, International Falls is still having its wettest year on record and is on track to break its all-time annual precipitation record. So, we're seeing elements of what we see on that latest map there. We're seeing elements of that even again this year, even though it's a more isolated part of the state. It's closer to where a lot of folks on this in this discussion live. When we look at what's happening with the extremes, so we have 38 stations that have been collecting rainfall data for at least 100 years. And when we just look at what's happening among those 38 stations, so we're not using everything available in Minnesota, we're only using the stations with very long records. And when we look at just those and we kind of do an annual census, like what's the biggest rainfall of any of these 38 stations? Well, you could see if you look along the bottom of this graph, those individual dots just show a given year's largest rainfall among those 38 stations. You see that a lot of years, maybe there's not a huge change as you go from the beginning of the 20th century to now. But then if you look at the top, what you're seeing is it's not every year, but it is with increasing frequency and also at increasing magnitude. We're starting to see precipitation events that we just never had really experienced before. Where if you look at the first half or so of this graph, you don't see any values above 8 inches. And then all of a sudden they become much more common, right? And they become more common more frequently as you get farther right, and the values are going up too. So it's not that every year is getting bigger rains than they've ever seen. It's just that these really big rains, the ones that you've never seen before, somewhere in the state, they are becoming more common. We're getting more of what we call mega rains, which is when at least 1,000 square miles is hit by a 6-inch rainfall. That's a huge rainstorm. And here's one example from just south of you in 2016. So you can see the area that gets outlined on the map. That's the area that got hit the hardest, where they had over 6 inches of rain. The animation on the left is just a radar loop for several hours from the Twin Cities. And you can see that the storms just kept regenerating and barely moved. And you ended up with basically catastrophic flooding as you headed over towards the St. Croix River area in Pine County. Parts of the Brainerd Lakes area were hit very, very hard by these rains also. And that was also a really stormy summer. This year, we haven't had one of these rains in Minnesota. They don't happen every year. They're still very rare. It's just that their frequency has ticked up pretty substantially. So they're about 2 to 3 times more common in the most recent few decades than they were in, say, the later part of the 20th century. So most recent 2 decades, they've increased by about 2.5 times what they were at the end of the 20th century. So that is even though it's a very rare event, it's a noteworthy uptick. And when we talk about what these things do, I mean, here's a before image of a soccer field near Moose Lake, and there's after. They got the kids off the field. You don't have to worry. And then they're actually different days. Here's the same event actually in Duluth, Minnesota. This is the big flood of 2012, before down at Brewery Creek, and then after. And again, the point isn't that this is happening everywhere all the time. It's just that these types of very rare events are still rare, but they are becoming somewhat more common, and they're happening in more places. When we look into the future, the precipitation is expected to keep increasing. This is just annual average precipitation. I wouldn't take the details seriously here, because this is just a blend of many, many different climate projections. So don't focus on the details. The bigger picture is that the kinds of precipitation increases that we've already observed over the last, say, 5 decades, where average precipitation has increased between 1 and 4 inches in Minnesota, and even higher in far southeastern parts of Minnesota. We would expect those types of increases to occur again between now and, say, the middle of the 21st century. So by 2050 or so. So again, there will be variations along the way. Not every year is going to be wet. Some years are going to be disastrously dry. It's just that the projections are for more precipitation to at least fall from the sky, and more intense precipitation also. So the kinds of changes that we already looked at, where the heaviest rainfall of the year has been increasing, at least occasionally, that is expected to continue. The frequency of days with 1 or 2 or 3 inches of rain are going to continue increasing. Doesn't mean that every year is going to be bad everywhere. It just means that you'd expect over time a tendency towards even more than what we're having now. And oddly, heavy snowfall has been increasing. I say oddly because, this is a period of tremendous wintertime warming in Minnesota. So here's the same set of maps except for temperatures. And you can see, the first part of the 20th century was cooler. The latter part of the 20th century, much warmer. Basically, the warmest periods on record have been in the 2000s and the 2010s. That's as far up as these maps go. But, it's not that every single year is the warmest year we've ever had, but we are breaking those records with increasing frequency. And when we look at what this really means for Minnesota, the map on the left is just that annual average temperature. And you see your part of the state is among the fastest warming parts of the state. This pattern of greater warming in the north and lesser warming in the south, this actually extends across the entire continent. So the areas in the tropical regions have the least total warming, and the areas in the Arctic regions in northern Canada have the most total warming. And where you really see this stand out is that middle map, wintertime low temperatures. So in your region, a typical night, the lowest temperature during the night on a typical winter day, that would be December, January, February, is now on average about 7 degrees, maybe more, warmer than it would have been at the beginning of the 20th century. Again, that does not mean that every night is literally 7 degrees warmer than it was the beginning of the 20th century. What it means is if you randomly select a series of nights, that's what you're going to find from both periods. Still substantial warming in southern Minnesota during the winter nights, but it's not as dramatic as what we see in northern Minnesota. And then on the right, it's the same thing, but the highest temperature during the summertime days, which would be June, July, and August. And what you see is northern Minnesota is really the only part of the state that has kind of noteworthy warming of those summertime high temperatures. But note that it's just nothing like what we're seeing with the winter lows. And in much of the state, it's you can say that winter's warming anywhere from 3 to 5 times faster than summer. International Falls, for example, average January low temperature. So take a randomly selected January night now in International Falls, and this goes right up through this most recent winter. So it includes some of the cold conditions from this past January. But a typical January night now is on average going to be at least 9 degrees warmer than a typical January night in the middle of the 20th century, just 6-7 decades ago. Big changes. And we're seeing this across the state. And so when we look at this chart, is just one station in western Minnesota called Milan. And it has what it's showing is the blue bars show that during the 2010s, annual snowfall, seasonal snowfall was about as high, it was as high or higher than they had ever observed. And this is a really good station. If we look at the Grand Rapids or the Duluth station, it's not an identical pattern, but it's similar um, that snowfall remained high even though while we've had all that winter warming. But you also see that little orange chart, that little orange trace showing many more thaw days where the wintertime temperatures just remain entirely above freezing. And we've seen this everywhere in Minnesota. So even in northern Minnesota, there's more days that remain above freezing than we used to have, even though there's many times as much or more snow falling than we used to have. And what that means, means that we're seeing more days. It's not a huge, it's not like an explosion of days that are where it's like pouring rain in the wintertime, but something that used to happen maybe once per winter is now happening twice per winter on average, where you get rain falling between December and February. That's something that used to be less common and now is more common. And because of that, because of the thaw conditions and the rain conditions, our average snowpack is decreasing. So there's less snow on the ground, even though many of those years are having more snow falling. It's just we're having a harder time keeping it on the ground. And this is something that actually affects the lakes a lot here. That this general warming of winter has shortened our lake ice season. Depending on how you look at it, and depending, lakes differ for how deep they are and how big they are. And this isn't something we're seeing every single year, of course, because we still have very cold winters with good ice seasons. But on average, there's been a decline of 1 to 2 weeks in our ice season, going back a few decades. And you could push it back to, again, about the late 60s or early 70s, and it looks like about 2 weeks of total ice loss on average on Minnesota lakes. So that means a longer open water season, which means more chance for the sun to get in and heat up the water, more chance for things to run off of the surrounding land and get into the water, and that means also just a longer runoff season too. So lakes have been on average getting warmer, at least where there's been measurements, and they're projected to also get warmer, and that's changing some of the availability of cold water refuge for the species that really need it. Just quickly here, there hasn't been, as I had mentioned, this is the same graph we've looked at for other parts of the year. This is just summertime average high temperatures across Minnesota. And what you see is there's no clear upward trend. You do see 2021 pretty warm on average in Minnesota, the high temperatures, but they don't stand out historically. And we don't have that picture yet indicating that we've left historical ranges. And if we see this same pattern here at every location in Minnesota. They all have maybe slightly different display on the graph, but they all kind of show the same thing. If we look at the highest temperatures of the year, even the 10 or 15 hottest days of summer, we're not yet at a point where we're seeing anything that rivals what we had historically, and we're certainly not leaving our historical ranges. So that's good news, because we haven't yet, we've kind of got our hands full with the changes we've seen in winter and the increased precipitation. Unfortunately, even the most optimistic projections, this one I'm showing here, which is a scenario that we're extremely unlikely to be able to realize because it would have required aggressive cuts in emissions already. Maybe, who knows, but it's unlikely. But even the models that simulate that particular scenario show that there's so much additional greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere that are already going to contribute to warming that even if we were to make those cuts, there'll be pretty substantial increases in the number of days that reach or exceed 90 degrees Fahrenheit during the summer. So in what you see in northern Minnesota is an increase of maybe 10 days per summer on average by the middle of this century that are 90 degrees or higher. we're just starting to see those changes now. We still have some time to prepare for them. We haven't gotten there yet, but climate models are pretty much unanimous that the heat has not arrived yet, but it's coming in terms of summertime heat. So if we just summarize all of this, the region has already gotten wetter and warmer. We've had bigger precipitation extremes, and especially the warmth has really been driven by wintertime warming. It's a little counterintuitive. A lot of people they kind of think warmer equals hotter, but really it's the average temperature has increased, and it's mostly, not entirely, but mostly been because we've had warmer winters. When we look at the projections, we see that those trends are going to continue. And of course, all the normal variations are going to be baked into these trends. So we're still going to have years that are warmer or cooler than you would expect from the trend alone, or wetter or even drier than what you would expect from the trend alone. So these kinds of variability, these ups and downs, are going to continue. Drought is going to remain a fixture of our climate and could indeed get worse once we get to point number 4, which is that the hot weather hasn't, arrived yet, but we do expect it to by the middle of this century. So thank you so much, everybody. Been patient. I know that there's some time for questions, and I look forward to hearing them from you. So thanks a lot.
Great. Dr. Blumenfeld, thank you very much. That was really interesting. Now I'd like to bring in Itasca Water's board member and manager of Itasca County's AIS program, Bill Granchis, for our Q&A section. Welcome, Bill.
Oh, hello, and welcome to today's Q&A section. That was really fascinating, and I deal with aquatic invasive species, and frankly, I see climate change being more of an impact on our lakes and our species that we have in our waters than invasive species almost. So this really hit hard for me. As these questions were being typed in, you ended up answering a lot of them. So we're going to do our best to probably sort out the ones that were least well answered. How about that? Anyway, do not submit questions by using the chat function. I'll read the questions out loud and they will be answered by Dr. Blumenfeld. We may combine some similar questions and we may not get to all your questions, but please feel free to email us after the program if you still have unanswered questions. So let's begin. Our first question. Oh, new one. I saw a presentation within the past couple of years that showed changes near Hibbing were most drastic in the continental US. Is that true?
Yeah, it could be. I would, we have a limited number of weather stations that have been for long-term observation, and quite frankly, the station at Hibbing is not what I would consider to be one of our signature stations. So I would be careful with the interpretation of that. We have an excellent excellent station at the Grand Rapids Forest Research Center, and another one in Cloquet, and some other good ones scattered throughout northern Minnesota. And those do show that northern and northeastern Minnesota have been among the fastest warming parts of the country. Now, I can't show people, I can't share my screen currently, but that map where we looked at the temperature changes, the person asking the question said, I saw a presentation a few years ago. And so a few years ago, it was accurate based on what was the current normal conditions and the changes of the normal climate values. It was true that Minnesota was the fastest warming part of the lower 48 United States, and that northern Minnesota was the fastest warming part of Minnesota. So that was it. That would actually back up what the person saw. However, in the last 2 years, the new climate normals were released. And what we saw was that Minnesota is still warming pretty fast, but other parts of the country really caught up. So we're no longer kind of number one that way. We're part of a much larger cohort of states that are all rising, that where the warming is about as fast as it's ever been. So I think we might lose that distinction of being the fastest warming part of the fastest warming state in the US, just because there are other parts of the country that really caught up in the last climate normals. period. But that just is
Okay.
kind of sober because it just means there's a huge part of the US that's warming really fast now.
So true. Okay, next question. Are these predictions as a whole good for our agricultural industry in Minnesota, raising us from zone 3 to zone 4, etc.?
Yeah, good question. We talk about this a lot. Agriculture has benefited from, if you're talking about kind of big ag anyway, agriculture has benefited from advanced genetics and advanced genetic interventions that have helped some of the crops become much more resilient to a lot of these changes. There's still, in general, kind of a northward push of what can grow where. So that's accurate. But some of our signature years where we would look at things in Minnesota and say, well, this was our biggest kind of climate change year because it was very warm and very wet, like 2016, oddly was also kind of a record year for corn. It might still be the current record holder, but so we've seen with big agriculture, I guess maybe less dependency on what the climate does and more resilience to what the climate does. But for gardeners in general, it's been a much bigger challenge because you don't necessarily have Monsanto at your side helping you with, or smaller farmers who grow fruits and vegetables. It's been a bigger challenge because, what can grow where has been marching northward.
Sure.
I would say, for those who are really curious, that does introduce some new opportunities, but it also introduces new opportunities for invasive species that hadn't existed here before.
Absolutely.
And also, and that includes a northward migration of, fungi and types of disease that are
Sure.
new, and pests too that are
Sure.
just new to this area.
Yeah,
So,
and longer summers, warmer summers, and that increases growing season for the things in the water too. All right, this one's
absolutely.
near. This next question is near and dear to my heart since I just went out and bought a generator. Anyway, up here, it seems like we are seeing a lot of trees go down and power goes out. When the soil is very moist and winds and high winds happen, is this something we might see increasing in the future?
Yeah, that would be one where, okay, so great question. It just happens to get at sort of two different issues that we face in our field. One I kind of talked about, which is that when you think of like the big severe thunderstorms, the ones that maybe produce the damage that require you to get a generator, there really is no consensus on where those have been and are going. Some of that's because of the data that we're just better at observing those storms now, and we've got more eyes on them than ever before, and that kind of contaminates the data record. And some of it is because the way that the global climate is changing by putting more heat into the atmosphere is good for one type of thunderstorm, the kind that produces really heavy rain, but it isn't necessarily good for the kind that produce tornadoes and hail, because those are reliant on other ingredients that might be decreasing as global temperatures rise. So there's, on one hand, there's no consensus on that. On the other hand, we've observed in Minnesota over the last 2 years a lot of just wind, really gusty days. And in fact, we don't know that we've ever observed anything quite like what we've had over the last year and a half or so, where just the number of 30-mile-an-hour and 40-mile-an-hour gusts on days when there aren't even storms, just regional wind driven by what's called a pressure gradient. The problem with saying we're going to have more of those is we don't even know what these are being caused by and what they're responding to. It's still kind of a cutting edge question that scientists we're trying to understand, okay, what's the scope? How widespread are these higher wind gusts? And are they responding to something that, is akin to one of these normal variations? Like maybe we've just gotten into the sweet spot of weather systems where we're seeing a lot of wind and it's related to just a kind of a general shift in a pattern,
Sure.
or is it actually a fundamental change in the way our climate is behaving, in which case we would then need to figure out what to expect in the future. But I would say, if you just assume that there's going to be more heavy precipitation and therefore more wet soils, and that even if just sort of windy conditions or severe weather conditions remain the same in the future, that would then point to more instances of potential tree throw where trees go down and power goes out just because you'd have more days with high soil moisture. So there's a lot of ways, but that's all speculation, and I don't have the back, I can't say I'm standing on a strong compendium of agreed upon science there.
Sure. Well, that's all we have time for questions. Fascinating questions and great answers too. And thank you for all those great questions. Okay, Steph, let's go back to you.
Okay, thank you. That concludes our program for today. I hope you enjoyed the 5th program in our Itasca Waters Practical Water Wisdom series. Itasca Waters thanks Dr. Kenny Blumenfeld for today's program. We thank Bill Granches for hosting the Q&A portion, and thanks to Itasca Waters board member Jan Sandberg for handling all the background work. Most importantly, we thank you for having the interest in clean water and taking the time to be here today. A big tip of the hat goes to the Itasca Waters Education Committee and its partners for all they've done to produce today's programs, as well as the programs to follow this year. Today's program was recorded and will soon be available on our website, itascawaters.org. We will be emailing you an evaluation, or you can use the link on your screen when the webinar ends. I know it seems hard to think evaluations matter when our speaker was so excellent today, but there is information on the evaluation that will help us plan for future programs. So please take a moment to complete it. Our next live program will be at noon on September 1st, entitled PFAS in Minnesota, Understanding the Impact of Forever Chemicals. You can sign up now by going to our website, itascawaters.org. I'm Stephanie Kessler. Thanks, and see you on September 1st.